Year 10 and 11, welcome to some quick revision on an inspector calls and the key themes, responsibility and the younger versus older generations. Before we begin, it is essential that we understand the purpose of the play. J.B. Priestley was a co-founder of a socialist party, and therefore he felt strongly about his political views which favoured socialism. Priestley wanted to encourage his audience to dislike Mr. and Mrs. Birling and their moral values, and even family values, and he believed this could inspire the audience to lead a better life. Priestley uses the character of Mr. and Mrs. Birling as a metaphorical representation of capitalism. Priestley was concerned about the consequences of social inequality in Britain and the disparity caused by wealth and class divide. And he outlines the potential evil side of money and capitalism. And by promoting socialism, Priestley also uses the play as propaganda for the Labour Party. Two of the biggest themes in an inspector calls are responsibility and the younger versus older generations. We're going to look at those themes together, because the quotations that we use for responsibility we can also use in the younger versus older generation as well. So this is just going to be a reminder of some key quotations with an explanation here and there. If we begin with the inspector then for responsibility, the role of the inspector has a few different roles, isn't it? He's a teacher, he is the potential subconscious of the characters when they begin, obviously when Sheila and Eric begin to feel guilty. He is the catalyst that speeds up the events within the play. He voices the concerns of J.B. Priestley, and the inspector is our metaphorical representation of socialism. And if we're talking about responsibility, his key quotations are as follows. So at the top of the slide there we've got, we have to share something. If there's nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt. Now this is his powerful language when he is addressing and advising Sheila. Now don't forget, in this exam on the AQA syllabus, AO2, Assessment Objective 2, asks us to analyse the writer's method. So if we want to take a couple of quotes and analyse language, in this quotation, we've got the inclusive pronoun we. And the inclusive pronoun we is key here because it includes everybody within the play. It includes the inspector, Sheila, Eric, Mr. and Mrs. Birling and Gerald. And there we realise in the theme of responsibility that the inclusive pronoun highlights that they are all responsible. It's a chain of events, as the inspector rightly pointed out, that each member of the family and Gerald have done something to affect this girl's life that has resulted in her suicide. And that is also reinforced by our as well, that the guilt belongs to them. If you wanted to go further in that little bit of analysis, you could do share our guilt. Clearly, the verb share there is important, isn't it? And the verb share again is the inspector giving advice to Sheila that sharing the guilt and accepting responsibility for your actions could potentially make the world a better place if we are responsible for one another, if we look after the community. Which leads me to the next quote. The inspector's final speech, we know, is massively important. And I've just took a little section of it here, and we've got, we don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for one another. So if we're talking about our inclusive pronoun again, then it is here again, and it's repeated. And it's massively important once again. In an analysis of we don't live alone, we are members of one body, we are responsible for one another. He is reminding the whole family of the need for community. And that links you straight down to the next quotation, because remember what the inspector is then pointing out is that if we don't take care of one another, then we are going to be taught a lesson. And he says that the lesson we're going to be taught is in fire, blood and anguish. And that triple there is heavily metaphorical, isn't it? And the metaphor is linked to hell in fire, blood and anguish. It is also linked to this idea of punishment, and potentially the link there to another world war. Don't forget, we are a society who have suffered 2 world wars, and that was one of Priestley's issues. And then the last quotation on this slide then is when he says, you'll be able to divide up the responsibility between you. Again, I suppose that links to the first quotation we analysed about him trying to teach the family. He has lost his patience here though, hasn't he? He's lost his patience with the family bickering. This is Act 3. And don't forget, by now, Sheila has accepted blame. Mr. Birling has denied any blame. Mrs. Birling is blaming the father of the child. Eric blames Mrs. Birling. And other than Sheila at this moment in time, nobody is admitting to what they've done. So he obviously says you'll be able to divide up the responsibility between you, hoping that will teach them. But remember, by the end of the play, it's only Sheila and Eric who really do divide up the responsibility. Mr. Birling then is our metaphorical representation of capitalism. And we know that he's got a reputation in the town. He owns Birling and Co., which is a factory business. We assume he owns lots of factories that employ girls. He believes that the pay he gives these girls is quite reasonable. And we know that he is oblivious to the consequences of his actions, don't we? We know as well that he likes to try and use his social position and who he knows to intimidate and influence. He is described in the original stage directions as a heavy-looking man, rather provincial in his speech, and he describes himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. Okay, we know, obviously, as I say, that he represents capitalism and right-wing political views. He values wealth, which is very clear when we read the play with some of the statements he makes. Okay. Priestley, as I say, uses the character of Mr. Birling, and obviously he would want him to be disliked, which is why he makes him look foolish in the beginning. I realise that the Titanic quote and the Germans don't want war quotes are massively important, but in terms of responsibility and the young versus the old, we're going to look at the quotations that I've put on this slide. Now, at the very top there, it says a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. Clearly, he is portrayed as very self-centred, isn't he? Very selfish. This is a direct contrast to the inspector, because where the inspector uses we and our as your inclusive pronoun, Mr. Birling is very much concerned about himself. And we get that a lot in the way he addresses the inspector in Act 1. That top quotation links straight to the one underneath it. I can't accept any responsibility. And that is his flat out denial of having ever done anything wrong to Eva Smith. And that again, in turn, links to this statement at the bottom. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? And this here is key, because this is him abandoning any social responsibility. And that is huge in a play whereby the author is highlighting the issues within a capitalist society and trying to promote socialist ideals. The quotation that's quite interesting on this slide is, if you don't come down hard on these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth, which is here. And this metaphor actually highlights Mr. Birling's admission that he needs to be firm with his workers and that people should be firm with their workers or they'll take advantage. Now, the irony here, as an audience member, and remember dramatic irony is one of the key techniques that Priestley uses, is actually Eva Smith only asks for a tiny little pay rise. And then Mr. Birling uses this metaphor very much as an example of exaggeration, as if she was asking for more than that. And also don't forget, in Act 3, Mr. Birling says, oh, I'd give thousands and thousands, and it's just too late. Offering money to try and sort out a problem that could have been sorted out by money. There's a heavy irony in there. And obviously it's just too late to offer that money then. So again, earlier when I said he's very much concerned about wealth and his status, you can see that here. And that again almost directly links to it's my duty to keep labour costs down. And again, that's very much a capitalist view on society, on life. And this is one of the problems that Priestley had with society, this massive disparity between the classes. And obviously, if you've got this system whereby Mr. Birling can manipulate the prices and the costs, as he says, it's higher costs, higher prices, lower costs, or whatnot, then the rich are going to get richer and the poor are obviously going to get poorer, and there's going to be that massive divide. So from the very get-go, Mr. Birling denies any responsibility, and we see that in that quote, it has nothing what to do with this wretched girl's suicide. Inspector, he is unaware of the consequences of his actions. And when we're dealing with the younger versus the older generations, at the end of the play, Mr. Birling refuses that responsibility, and worse than that, he uses the word joke. And that's at the end of the play. He talks about how the famous younger generation can't take a joke. We are talking about the death of a woman, and he thinks it is funny, and he makes light of it. So not only does he deny responsibility, but actually he looks foolish at the beginning. He looks self-centered and selfish all the way through the play. He is concerned about wealth. And then in this instance, he is portrayed as somebody quite heartless, laughing at the misfortune of a girl and of the lower classes. If we move to Mrs. Birling, I want to start with one of her most important quotations in Act 1, which is when she says here at the bottom, girls of that class. And what she does is she makes a huge generalisation here, doesn't she? As if all working class girls are doomed to result or end up with a life that equals something bad. And it's very... It almost dehumanises the individual girls within the working class, and as I say, it clumps them all together, as if all working class girls are going to end up like Eva Smith, or all lower class girls are going to end up like Eva Smith. And that shows you that Mrs. Birling is exactly what she's described in the opening, the top there, a rather cold woman. For assessment objective 2, we have to look at the writer's method, so we might actually analyse the adjective cold here, because it is a representation of not only her personality, but how she's emotionally cold and doesn't feel any sympathy towards Eva Smith. That is your stage directions in Act 1. We are also told that she's her husband's social superior as well. When we are talking about the disparity and the divide between the classes as well, Mrs. Birling also lives up to this when she says, we can't understand why the girl committed suicide, and she makes no attempt to try and understand it either. And there's that, again, that detachment and that distance from any social responsibility or acceptance of one's actions. And Act 2, she actually lives up to the description we get on the first page of this cold woman, because she says, unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of. And what she does there actually is she then says, obviously, that Mr. Birling, Sheila and Gerald, unlike the other three, look at your subordinate clause there, is she's blaming them. She's subtly saying that actually they've done things that they should be ashamed of, but actually I'm going to absolve myself of any blame here, of any responsibility. I did nothing I'm ashamed of. Now, the issue we have here as an audience member is when we find out what she's done, we are disgusted. I'm going to come to that in a moment. Now, when Mrs. Birling is questioned and we realise she has turned Eva Smith away from the charity, she not only reinforces this stereotypical presentation of a cold upper-class woman, but she highlights one of Priestley's main points. Now, within a capitalist society, we did not have the welfare state. Now, had this been under a socialist government, under a Labour Party, when Eva Smith turned up at the charity, she would have been given money and resources. The welfare state provided shelter, money, necessities to those who were unemployed or in times of desperation or in times of need. And we know that Eva Smith was unemployed and pregnant, and the welfare state would have looked after her. So therein lies another one of Priestley's lessons about capitalism versus socialism, and the fact that under a socialist system, people, the community, would have taken responsibility and would have taken care of Eva Smith and the child. Now, we know that Mrs. Birling turns her away because she uses the name Mrs. Birling. So actually, girls like Eva Smith were at the mercy of people like Mrs. Birling. And when she feels more pressured, she then turns the blame unknowingly to Eric, because she says, go and look for the father, it's his responsibility. And she, inadvertently is blaming Eric there. And that short sentence, it's his responsibility, is the accusation that actually it's Eric's fault. And she doesn't realise, and she's passing the blame. Much like Mr. Birling passed the blame when he was being interrogated. She also, much like Mr. Birling, highlights this huge disparity between the classes. And that's in this massive quote when she's talking about, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have, if, as she said, he didn't belong to her class. Now look at that line. Priestley has used commas before and after it, so actually it stands out even more. I've just highlighted it in the middle there. He didn't belong to her class and was some drunken young idler. Then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him. And she's very severe here in the blaming of the father again, and it's to shirk the responsibility away from herself. She was the one that did turn her out of the charity, and the very definition of charity there's a huge irony in the fact that she wouldn't give it to someone as desperate as Eva Smith. Once, obviously, that doesn't work, the blaming of Eric doesn't work, she actually then blames Mr. Birling. And in the stage directions, we are actually told that she's becoming agitated, probably because she's feeling the pressure of the inspector. Agitated, now you can see that, I've just circled it. Remember before you start accusing me of anything again, that it wasn't I who had her turned out of employment, which probably began it all. And I suppose in this analysis we might look at the direct pronoun you, because the direct pronoun you here allows Mrs. Birling to accuse Mr. Birling, and before you start. It wasn't I who had her turned out of employment, which probably began it all. And again, if you look at cleverly Priestley's use of the dash there, just before which we get that pause, and that pause before which probably began it all reminds us that Mr. Birling did begin the chain of events. But look, you've got Mrs. Birling. I accept no blame for it at all. Then I don't know anything about this girl. Unlike the other three, I'm not ashamed. Blame the father. Oh, he didn't belong to her class. And then she blames Mr. Birling. So actually, Mrs. Birling is doing anything to get out of the blame here. Remember, she was agitated that Eva had referred to herself as Mrs. Birling, and then she says that I used my influence to have her refused, and that is a massive quotation for us. But when we hear the story of Eva Smith refusing money, Mrs. Birling makes that flippant remark as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Mrs. Birling dehumanises Eva Smith and the lower classes all the way through the play. And again, it's this highlighting and promoting socialism as a better means of living. And Priestley does that through Mr. and Mrs. Birling. So, as I've said, they deny responsibility. They are a metaphorical representation of capitalism. They don't learn anything by the end of the play. They think it is hilarious that this has happened. Remember when we'll all have a laugh about this in the morning. Sheila and Eric don't think that, and we're going to have a look at Sheila and Eric now. So if we move to Sheila, we'll start with a huge quotation from Sheila at the top right. These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And that is pretty much in Act 1 when she hears Mr. Birling's side of the story. And it's a metaphor, isn't it? These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And she is trying to remind Mr. Birling, and I suppose Mrs. Birling, and society and the audience watching the play in 1946, that workers and the lower classes, the working classes, should still be treated like human beings. They should not be disregarded or dismissed or treated like animals, as the inspector rightly points out when he's talking to Eric about his treatment of Eva Smith. And again, Priestley's very clever in his punctuation and where he chooses to pause for that emphasis. Look at the dash there. At the beginning of the play, Priestley describes Sheila as a pretty girl, pleased with life, rather excited. We know she's getting engaged to Gerald, and she's quite naive, isn't she? And she's lived quite a sheltered upbringing so far. And she develops the most, doesn't she? And she matures the most throughout the play. And with Eric, she represents the younger generation, the generation that Priestley saw as impressionable, and the generation that can change society and potentially the world. And she does develop, and she accepts responsibility, doesn't she? Now, initially, her quotation, "You talk as if we are responsible," initially shows actually that she's a little bit naive to the situation, and again to the consequences of her actions. Don't forget, she's her father's daughter. But once she finds out who Eva Smith is, and the incident, she describes the incident at Millwards, and she takes responsibility and blame instantly. She knows what she's done, and she knows that this is a link in the chain of events after Mr. Birling had her fired. In terms of the writer's method, one of the key quotations for Sheila that shows that she is fully aware of her actions and accepts them is the stage direction distressed. We are told on numerous occasions that she is distressed. We are also told that Eric becomes distressed as well. That adjective highlights the physical and emotional change within Sheila. And this also links us to this bit miserably. So I'm really responsible. We've got our stage directions in this adverb. And we've also got a question. So I'm really responsible. And yes, it's a question, but within that question is her acceptance. Pretty soon after that, she also says, I won't believe, it's simply my fault that in the end she committed suicide. Now again, if we are analysing writer's method here, you have got your pause. I suppose that's an instance of denial. I can't believe, I won't believe. And then if we look again at our adverb, simply, then she breaks it down for us. Simply, it's my fault. Sheila, as we know, represents socialism by accepting the responsibility for her actions, by accepting how she has treated someone else, by taking responsibility. Yes, it's too late, but she still does. She says very, very simply as well, it was my own fault. She's very apologetic once she realises what she's done. Much like the inspector earlier on when he was using inclusive pronouns to present society as a community that should be looking after each other, Sheila does the same. Between us, we killed her. And there it is that Sheila, remember, she becomes perceptive as the play goes on as well. She realises that Mrs. Birling and Eric have both had a part to play in the death before they do. She even says something along the lines of, you mustn't put up a wall because he'll break it down. She even, she makes claims about, oh, don't you see, he knows, the inspector knows already. So her using the inclusive pronoun as well is again this idea of community. They're all responsible. They should accept that they are responsible. Sheila tells her mum and dad as well, which links to your inclusive pronoun, you don't seem to have learnt anything. And that's, again, our difference between the younger and older generation. Yes, it's the acceptance and denial of responsibility, but it's that Sheila and Eric have learned a lesson here. And she says, I'll never do it again. And that's the lesson that she's learned, isn't it? But when she addresses Mr. and Mrs. Birling, she realises that they haven't changed. And perhaps you could argue she changes her opinion of her parents. And she then accuses her parents of this denial. When I'm talking about Sheila being distressed as well, I suppose that does link to, I can't believe it, I won't believe it, because if she believes it, then it is very distressing that she has led a young girl to suicide, a girl that she admittedly described as being pretty. And by the end as well, she gives Gerald the ring back, and that shows her maturity. It shows us that she is prepared to be independent, an independent woman in this society. And she prefers honesty, doesn't she? Because she says to Gerald something along the lines of, oh, that's the best thing you've said all night, when he tells the truth about the affair. So your naive, immature girl who at the beginning was going, Mummy, Daddy, look at my ring, and seemed shallow and superficial by the end, is a perceptive woman accepting the responsibility for her actions and not really being influenced by her parents anymore and or wealth in terms of marrying Gerald. Eric, then, we know, is squiffy at the beginning and he drinks a lot. We know that, and even Sheila knows that. Sheila says he's been steadily drinking too much. Now, when Eric's story develops in Act 3, the sad thing he says, and it's not on the slide, is that he wasn't in love with her or anything. He wasn't in love with her or anything. He liked her and she was a good sport. So he doesn't care for Daisy Wren and Eva Smith at all. And again, it's not on the slide, I'm just summing it up before we go into these quotations. As I mentioned earlier, the inspector says Eric just used her at the end of a drunken evening as if she was an animal. So that simile is the inspector, I suppose, condemning and telling off Eric for his behaviour and the way he treats Eva Smith. And there's a link there between the way Mrs. Birling dehumanises her and Eric also did in his treatment of her, didn't he? Now, when we realise that Mrs. Birling sent her away from the charity, Eric is upset and he blames Mrs. Birling. And he says, then you killed her. She came to you to protect me and you turned her away. And again, we're going to be looking at Priestley's use of the pause for dramatic effect. Then you killed her. She came to you to protect me and you turned her away. Again, look at your repetition of the pronoun you. And the repetition of the pronoun you there is this accusing tone that Eric has and the agitation that he has at his mother, who has, as I see, inadvertently killed their grandchild. And that comes in that big quote, if we say the link there, my child, pause, your grandchild, pause, you killed them both. Look at your emotive language in killed as well. You killed them both. Actually accusing his mother of being a murderer there. And he's accusing her of not only that, but her disregard for human life. Sorry, I'm getting my words mixed up. Eric is much like Sheila. The fact remains that I did what I did. Repetition of I did there, you know, acceptance. And then this awful quote, I hate it. We did her in all right. As in, they ruined her, didn't they? Step by step along the way, each member of the family ruined her. In his admission, he says, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. Again, look at your adverb, easily, as if it happens to most men, or well, it easily happens. Well, you know, a lot of men would argue that it doesn't. We know that he's forced himself on her. He then admits responsibility to that, which is actually quite brave of Eric. And he ends the play much like Sheila. He addresses his parents. Here at the bottom, you're beginning to pretend now that nothing's really happened at all. I can't see it like that. The girl's still dead, isn't she? And there you get that question. And yes, she is dead, and it's because of their actions. And he accuses his parents, much like Sheila did. He is ashamed of their parents. He isn't interested that Mr. Birling has threatened to kick him out, that he has stolen the money. He blames Mrs. Birling more so. He says, you don't understand anything, you never did. As if she's always turned a blind eye. And actually, we know Mrs. Birling turns a blind eye to a lot of events because she says about the Gerald affair, we don't want to hear any details of this disgusting affair. Mrs. Birling doesn't want to face the truth, and that is one of Eric's problems with her, and it is Sheila's problem with both of her parents. Okay. So in a question about responsibility in the younger and older generations, it is quite straightforward to a degree. You've got socialism versus capitalism being metaphorically represented. You have got socialism being heralded as what Priestley believes to be the right set of values to lead society. You've got this propagandist theme running throughout that we really should vote Labour. He does this by presenting Mr. and Mrs. Birling almost as your villains, as the characters we dislike, as the characters that appear foolish. Whereas with Sheila and Eric, they accept what they've done in this socialist type style and have changed because of it in the end. And that is, I suppose, what Priestley's trying to teach a 1946 audience and even potentially a more modern day society like ourselves. Remember, assessment objective 2, you analyse the writer's method, so we will have to be analysing some keywords in there. I hope this video has been useful for some quick revision on themes, and good luck in your English literature exam.